Welcome to Prologue. I'm Kevin Landis. On behalf of the Theater and Dance program, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank our great supporters at UCCS, the Chancellor's Office, the Department of Visual and Performing Arts, the LAS Dean's Office, and TheaterWorks. I'd like to offer some brief comments to help frame the discussion we're about to have this evening. In a talk I did this summer, I was reminded of the now famous line from the musical Hamilton: "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" It's well known because, like so many quotes that stick, it feels so applicable to so many. Our topic tonight, one I've long wanted to consider, relates to that quote in, I hope, a simple way. So much of our history, our rich cultural heritage, our folklore, our mores are wrapped up in how we are able to tell our stories and how we assure that people have the right and the platform to speak. This, it seems to me, is the stuff of theater. An important part of that storytelling is the actual language that we use on the stage. Questions arise. What is lost when we translate a work? How does the story change? How does the audience makeup influence the translation choices? In the United States, even as we diversify the theater and accessibility becomes more and more a focus of our industry, still that audience often is English speaking. But after English, as we all probably know, the most common spoken language in the United States is Spanish. So today, we're approaching Spanish language and the theater to discuss how we tell stories. We're going to look at what we mean by adaptation and representation in times when we might verge accidentally or sometimes on purpose on appropriation. Now, this is a continuation of a prologue tradition of discussion of social and cultural conversations, but it's also a beginning. Well, this is the first time we've really done it in a digital format, first of all. I want to say that no one viewpoint, of course, is definitive, and I hope that this will give rise to more questions and that Prologue can highlight more voices on this topic going forward. I want to introduce our panelists today. Dr. Lynn Vidler is the new Dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and will help us get some perspective on the art and practice of adaptation. Their scholarship has focused on Spanish Golden Age theater, and they'll tell us more about that here in just a moment. To give us some contemporary artistic practice and examples, I've invited the extraordinary artist Brian Quijada, author of Where Do We Sit on the Bus and the upcoming musical theater performance creation Mexodus. It's a show, it's a concept album, and as you will see, it so well intersects with today's topics. Finally, we welcome Andrea Herrera, UCCS Associate Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Dr. Herrera, herself a playwright, will help us understand and unpack how language use in the theater relates to conceptions of inclusivity. So first of all, thank you to Lynn, to Andrea, and to Brian. And I want to start this out by throwing it to each of you, and maybe we'll start with Lynn. Could you tell us a little bit about your art and or your scholarship, especially how it relates to the topic at hand today? And why don't we do this? We'll go Lynn, and then Brian, and then Andrea. So Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. This is fantastic, and I appreciate the invitation. So my research as a faculty member has been in the drama of the Spanish Golden Age, which is roughly, it's the early modern period. So we're dealing with playwrights, roughly the time period of Shakespeare, but also a little bit later than that, but in Spain. And a lot of my work, as a performer myself, I was very interested in staging practices of the period and quickly realized, since there's no video of performances in the early modern period, I ran into issues of what evidence is there for what staging practices were like in the period, and what kinds of theoretical approaches could be used to validate that kind of research. So that's where I'm coming from in this particular question, but I've also dealt a lot with adaptations, because when you are performing early modern theater now, there's always the question of, what are you taking from then and what are you presenting from now? And so in my feeling, those two questions really have intersected for me in my research.
Lynn, before I go on to Brian, you have to tell us where you are. It looks like you're.
Yeah.
What's your backdrop?
My virtual background today is the Corral de Comedias in Almagro, Spain. And so if I get a chance to talk a little bit about the early modern period, which I think I will, in Spain, this is what a standard theater space would have looked like in that period. So instead of a separate architectural structure, like you would have seen in England, the corral is essentially a courtyard. So this is going to resonate for Brian, since he's in New York City right now. You know how, Brian, when there's like big buildings and there's just like that courtyard, empty courtyard space in the middle of
yes.
That's what this is right here. So these side balconies are apartments. And there wouldn't have been chairs in the early modern period. You would have stood there. But basically, if you had one of those apartments, it was really valuable because you could see the theater all the time or sell your butacas, right, to other people. And then this would have been, it's open to the sky, open air corral. Yeah.
Great, and the most creative backdrop we have of all. No, Brian, we shift across the country to New York City. Brian, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing broadly, but specifically, we'll get to Mexodus a little bit later.
Sure. Yes. Hi. Yes. Thank you. I'm Brian Quijada. I'm in New York City, and it's great to be here tonight and partake in this really great discussion and panel. And yeah, so I'm an actor, I'm a playwright, and a composer, and I say them in that order because I feel like that's the order in which I found these things. But I started writing plays about 6 years ago. The first one of which was called "Where Did We Sit on the Bus," which is a hip hop solo show, live looped. Live looping, by the way, is like I play a bunch of different instruments. So live looping is like layered music making. So I'll play piano, record that, let that keep repeating, pick up a guitar, lay that on top of it. Inspired by this piece, this experience of me raising my hand in the third grade and asking during a civil rights lesson, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, asking where Latinos sat on the bus. And my third grade teacher took a second and she was like, "Oh, they weren't around." And I was like, "What?" And I remember going home and I had a lot of questions from my parents. And it's coming of age story. It's kind of about me growing up, the Latinx experience. That's what I tend to write about. I tend to write about a lot about the Latinx community and the experience and immigration. I'm from the Chicagoland area originally, and my parents came from El Salvador in the 1970s. So I tend to write a lot about them. But language in that play is Spanglish because that's the language of our house, right? Like I speak mostly Spanish with my parents, but a little bit of English. We throw in some words there. Anyway, I have this other play that I just actually finished working on this past week called "Somewhere Over the Border," which is it's the real life story of my mother leaving when she was 16 years old, leaving my oldest brother in El Salvador when he was a child. Leaving El Salvador, going through Guatemala, the entirety of Mexico, on her and meeting friends who were also who also were trying to cross the border, on their way to meet El Gran Coyote de Tijuana. Coyote is somebody who helps you across, the person who kind of guides you into the United States illegally, and it's an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. The thing about that play is it's entirely in English. There's no Spanish words in it. With the idea, I think, being that you would kind of watch the play with a imaginary translator in your ear, right? That they're speaking Spanish, but you're getting the translation, right? So there is no in between there is no in between of Spanglish, because then you would beg the question of, well, what language are they speaking? And most recently, I've been working on this unfinished project called Mexodus that Kevin brought up, which is it is a concept album. I don't know what it is right now, but currently it's a musical project, live looped. It's a 2-man show that they make the music all on their own, and it's about the Underground Railroad that led south into Mexico. I mean, whenever I tell this story to anybody, people are like, "What is this?" It's mind blowing. So slaves in Texas or Louisiana who found it easier to cross into Mexico because the border was closer than going the northern route, the Harriet Tubman route, escaped into Mexico because it was Mexico. It was slavery was illegal. They made slavery illegal much earlier than the United States did. So this story follows Henry Haskins meeting Carlos with this very big myth in this kind of the folklore of this Underground Railroad south into Mexico of a slave who escaped, who crossed the Rio Grande on a bale of cotton. So in that, the language used in that one currently right now is exploring an actual mix between Spanish and English as they would have it's as they would have historically.
So Brian, I understand in a little bit, we're going to come back and take a look at Mexodus and hopefully show our audience some bits from it. So
that'd be great.
Thank you for giving us that overview. And
yes.
I want to just turn to Lynn to give us, so we have Spanish Golden Age, Mexodus, El Salvador, and Lynn, you're coming at this from another perspective. Could you talk a little bit about I'm sorry, not Lynn, Andrea, your perspective and some of the work that you're doing?
Absolutely, Kevin. And I don't mind if you confuse me with Lynn. That's a compliment. First, I want to thank you, Kevin, and also AJ. This is such an honor. I am so excited about this evening and sharing this presentation with Lynn and with Brian. So I know some of you know me. My PhD is in literature, but I'm also a creative writer. And among the various literatures I teach are post-colonial literature, Caribbean literature, and Latinx, what we would call in the United States, Latinx literature. So I approach my creative writing through the lens of, a literary scholar, also a freelance artist. And I have a kind of dark, murky career as a musician, which most people don't know. But I see myself as all of those things, kind of like you said, Brian. And my play, which is very tentatively titled The Presence of Absence, a Cuban Nocturne, is based loosely on my novel, but it's actually in dialogue with my novel, The Pearl of the Antilles, because I grew up in the Cuban diaspora community. A lot of all of my creative work and theoretical work focuses on that community. But in that work, I blend together both my creative side and my embodied side, and also, kind of the scholar's hat. So the play, which is going to be presented digitally, I don't know what that looks like, but we're hoping, Brian, to work with actors in New York, especially looking for Spanish Caribbean actors, which I'll talk about later, is going to be presented by the Cuban Cultural Center. And then when we determine when it's possible, we're going to present it live. And I'm working with a Cuban American director, and both the novel and the play incorporate both Spanish and English and some Spanglish. So I'll be speaking about that in a little bit. The play was presented as a heavily staged reading 4 years ago at Su Teatro in Denver. And it's also been in a couple different competitions. It was finalist twice. But we're really excited about this new format and the possibility of working with actors in New York who will then know the play and be able to, join us for the live presentation. But I also want to introduce behind me Guadalupe. The Virgen watches over me, although if I had thought about this, I would have brought Caridad del Cobre, who is the patron virgin of Cuba, who really watches over me. And I identify, for those of you who are Spanish speakers, as a cubanita pasada por agua. I think, Lynn, I introduced myself to you that way the first time, which my mother used to call me because I was born in the United States the first week of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. I used to say the revolution, and my students thought it was the US Revolutionary War, but I'm not quite that old. So my whole history and consciousness has been informed by that revolution and the impact on my family. So I'll leave it at that and then look forward to lots of questions later on. Thank you for including me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you to all three of you. I have I've never done one of these before digitally. So I typed out all these questions and exactly the things I'm going to ask. And I can already tell I'm going to go way off script because I have a bunch of questions that I want to get to. So this is like the popcorn round, if you will. I'm going to throw at each of you some quick questions that I think will help our perspective. We're all theater nerds, but I'm guessing not everyone watching is a theater, and I say theater nerd with of course love, but not maybe everyone is. So a few questions. Now, Lynn, you said a little bit about what the Spanish Golden Age, the era that we're talking about. One of the things the reason why the three of you coming together for a talk like this makes so much sense to me is we're talking about translation. We're talking about theater a lot of times happening in the United States that needs either adaptation or translation or Spanglish. I'm going to ask you, Brian, what Spanglish is. But Lynn, could you talk a little bit about the Spanish Golden Age? What are some of the characteristics of that era? And then could you also tell us what adaptation is and why it's so important to think about who's adapted what work?
Yes, great questions. Okay, so when we talk about the Spanish Golden Age, generally we put these kind of bookends between 1492 and 1700. So 1492, of course, is a watershed year for Spain. This is the year that Ferdinand and Isabel complete the reconquest of the peninsula from the Muslim occupation. They decide they're going to unite, create this nation state and empire. And that's also, of course, the year that Columbus arrives in the so-called New World to really extend that empire beyond the peninsula. And they also decide they're going to unify it based on religion. And so they force convert all the Jews and expel the rest. All of that happens in 1492. And then 1700, on the other end of that calendar spectrum, is the end of the Habsburg dynasty in the peninsula. Sometimes people, the theater nerds in us, like to end the Golden Age at 1681, which is the death of Calderón de la Barca, the playwright of Life is a Dream, La Vida es Sueño. But that's generally the framework. So during that time, while you have this incredible rise of Spain as a nation and an empire, it's also the same period of conflict and decline, right? So you have the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the rise of England, right, as more of an empire and a power, and all kinds of wars, conflict, political, religious conflict. This is the time of the Spanish Inquisition, of course. And so you might wonder, like, with all that conflict, why is it a golden age, right? But actually, the golden age term really refers to the flourishing of cultural and artistic production that happens during this time frame. And that happens a lot when you have a lot of social and political upheaval, right? Artists respond, humans respond. And so this is the period of the great Spanish masters in painting, Velázquez, Zurbarán, Murillo. In literature, Cervantes' Don Quixote is written during this period. And of course, all of the great poets, Santa Teresa de Jesus, Góngora Quevedo, Garcilaso de la Vega, and drama. So the great dramatists of the period. Drama is the entertainment of the period, like in England. And in fact, Cervantes really saw himself as a failed playwright. He really just wanted to be a playwright as good as Lope de Vega. And he called Lope the monster of nature, el monstruo de la naturaleza, because he was just so jealous. And of course, now worldwide, he's actually better known. But anyway, so big playwrights of the period. Lope de Vega alone claims to have written almost 1,500 plays. So when you compare that to Shakespeare's paltry production of fewer than 50, depending on who's counting, right? It's actually quite amazing, although we only actually have about 800 of those that we know that we can attribute to him. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I mean, thinking back on my education a little bit, there was always this sort of thought that if it weren't for the Spanish Inquisition, we'd be having Lope de Vega festivals in the summer, not Shakespeare festivals. And that gets to this idea of translation.
Yes. Yeah, I think if it weren't for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, that, right? I mean, if the Spanish Armada had not been defeated, I mean, this is I'm obviously, reducing history by a lot, but there are some of these seminal moments in history that just change the course, right, of the world. And I think this period is so interesting to me because it actually there's so many parallels to our moment right now in American history, right? You just have all this kind of like social and cultural upheaval, and one might perceive a decline in the strength of the world as a world power, and all of the creative responses that are happening to the period. So you asked about adaptation, and I want to talk about that. I don't, this is kind of my definition, I think, and we can argue about whether or not what you all think of it. But to me, an adaptation is any subsequent staging of a work after the first one, right? So you have some kind of original. Brian's like, no, that's a terrible definition.
I think it's great. I think it's great. No, I think it's a great definition.
It might be a little bit extreme, but if you think about it, that it does have this a little bit of anxiety of originality, but once you have this performance text out there, as distinguished from whatever's written on the page, what I call the dramatic text, that's the original. And anything after that, maybe even the next night, you might argue, right? It is an adaptation. And that the degree of adaptation can vary, right? You might have a fifth production that tries really hard to get as close to the first one, right? Or you might just cut some text. That Hamlet's awfully long. Do we really need this scene? It could just be cutting, but it could be a complete reimagination, right, of a particular text. I'll just use some recent examples of Romeo and Juliet because they're the most likely for people to be familiar with. You can think about Zeffirelli's film to Baz Luhrmann's film, or even West Side Story as an adaptation. And then the most recent revival, I love this term, Broadway uses the term revival, which is really an adaptation. I mean, but they use this term like as if it was like making it relive like what the original used to be, but it really isn't anyway. So Lin-Manuel Miranda contributed some translations, right, to I think it was like 2008 or 9 production on Broadway of West Side Story, where the sharks actually spoke Spanish.
Yeah, I just saw it. Viva Broadway just did a bunch of different, sorry to interrupt you, but I just saw it. It's like literally an hour ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Broadway, raising money for Broadway Cares. Right. I saw that adaptation, his adaptation.
So you got an adaptation of the original West Side Story, which is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, right? And ironically, Stephen Sondheim, when Diane Paulus directed Porgy and Bess for Broadway, which she didn't even call Porgy and Bess, she called it the Gershwins' Porgy and Bess, right? Because it was just sort of hacked and reimagined. And Stephen Sondheim got really upset. This isn't the real Porgy and Bess. And so these are some of the controversies that happen. People want what's authentic or original, but an adaptation can really, a successful adaptation can really sort of capture the moment, the space-time, the the zeitgeist, right, of whatever is makes that director decide this is a moment where this particular text in this particular way is going to resonate for me, for my audience, right now and right here.
That's so great, Lennon. This idea of authenticity, I think, is something we can continue to sort of get in on, because it's a fraught and troubled word. What is authentic? You know, I mean, there were some conversations this summer around Hamilton. We can't go 15 minutes without mentioning Hamilton. But the idea that if you're telling a story that isn't really American history, you're adapting what's authentic. Again, it goes back to that story. Who tells your story sort of question.
There's a lot of arguments. Like, I have historian friends who are very upset by Hamilton, right? Because that's not really what happened. That's not really how it went. And, you know, is that really what you want as you're producing, you know, a piece of theater?
Well, and just to frame this a little bit, the idea of, we think about adaptation, it makes sense, we see it all the time, but then if you're taking adaptation and filtering it through the lens of changing the language, if you're adapting Spanish Golden Age theater to an American audience, say, or I want to talk to Brian here in a moment about this Spanglish, this sort of in-between. You mentioned that word, which I think we've all heard, but what do you mean when you say that, when you say your family is speaking that? And we're going to see in a little bit of how you use sort of this blending of languages to reach or distance yourself from an audience. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think Spanglish has become its own language. I mean, yes, you could say that it is just a mix of English and Spanish, but in a lot of ways, I think it could have its own dictionary. There's like, I remember we would always say when you went to go park the car, right? Like, it's like, okay, vas a parquear el carro. Parquear, that's what we'd say, but the actual word is estacionar. Like, that's the actual Spanish word. Parquear is just the actual combination of the Spanish and the English into a made-up word that sounds like it should be a word. In fact, I thought it was a word. I was just like, yeah, this is the actual word, but it isn't. And so I grew up in a household where our parents were very adamant about us speaking only Spanish. In fact, my dad had to lie to us because, we'd come in speaking English from school, and eventually we were in a Home Depot and he's just like, yeah, I'm going to need a 2x4. And we look up at him, we're like, you speak English? He's just like, yeah. So it's for me, this introduction of English in our household didn't happen until much later, where then like, things like bipaporu, which is a real thing. Bipaporu is like, my mom would get the little thing of bipaporu, and every time we felt sick, and she'd put it on us. And I'm just like, that's like a really weird name. Until later, it occurred to me that she was just saying vapor rub, Vicks vapor rub, and I'm like, oh my god! Like, you're not saying Vicks vapor rub, you're saying a completely different new word. So anyway, I say Spanglish as yes, it is a fusion of English and Spanish, but so kind of common that it has created like an additional language of Spanglish, like a real new fusion of the two.
It definitely has its own syntax.
Yeah,
it has its rules and syntax and grammar and vocabulary, like any other language.
It totally does. And we grew up with words like palmolive, which is palmolive. My father asking for juice would say, por favor, quiero un poco de juicy.
Andrea, could we center in on this? This again, I mean, it keeps going back to this idea of when we translate this stuff to the stage, and we're going to see some examples here in a moment of authenticity. How is a culture being represented through the way language is used? And I asked you this both as an artist, a scholar, but also as our associate vice chancellor of diversity and inclusion. Did I get that right? I always
no,
the order.
It's a very long.
I get the order out of wrong, but inclusion is this idea that we've been talking a little bit about. Could you talk a little bit about what we mean by inclusivity in the theater, and perhaps how the use of language relates to that idea of inclusivity? And maybe you have some examples from your own play.
Sure, I'd love to. I want to comment. I love, Lynn, your concept of adaptation. But then I think about what, Brian, you're talking about, because Cubans will call what you were talking about inventando and adaptando, right? That we're literally adapting and inventing the language. And one quick comment about that I'd like to make is that as a writer, as a creative writer, I often would find that, like, but Kevin, I have a background in theater, both directing and acting. And so I would kind of call the voices of all these family dinners, and conversations with, they weren't just family, friends, strangers, who my parents had taken in. And when I would try to write the lines, both in the novel and also in the play, I would try to conjure those voices. And there are certain things that you cannot say in English. They just, not only are they ridiculous, but they don't capture the meaning in Spanish. So it's what's lost in translation. And so for me as a writer, especially with the play, because you have much shorter time to kind of connect with the audience. Unlike a novel where you can empty the ashtrays and close the door and close the cabinets, you can't do that in a play or a poem. And so I would figure out, like, who would be included and who would not be included when I would use a word. So, and Sandra Cisneros, the Chicanx writer, plays with this, because when you literally translate, like I think I mentioned to you, we have an Uncle Chico. That's not really his name. His name is Nemesio, but Uncle Chico is like Uncle Little, and because he was the baby in the family. So when you translate some of that stuff, or there's an expression, que barbaridad, which is like, what a barbarity. And I heard that more times as a kid, and it's not an expression you use, And so in terms of inclusion, because I know you want me to come back to that, I always think of inclusion two ways. In one way, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit, and I think, AJ, you have some ideas about this, is that Latinx writers, and I'm going to say Latinx, okay, other than not Latino and Latina.
But would you define that? Because there might be people who don't fully know what you mean.
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. Not everybody uses that terminology, but it's a term that means many things, like Latin with an X on the end. First of all, it moves us away from, a heavily gendered language. All Romance languages are gendered, and gendered in very traditional patriarchal ways, if you will. So in the one hand, it moves you away from that. It also taps into the imagination of not being disempowered by an X. I remember my Catalan former father-in-law on purpose would sign an X in this country as a statement. And I think about the context of Malcolm X, which more people think about, is that this is empowering the X, okay, in some way. Mm-hmm. So it means a lot of things for many people. Not all people in the US will call themselves Latino, Latina, Hispanic, or Latinx. So I don't suggest that this is a term that all Latins will call themselves, even though I have begun to adopt the terminology. It is also not a term that is used widely outside the United States. Is that?
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Thanks,
Kevin, because I know not everybody's familiar with that. But in terms of inclusion and exclusion, I would say it works a couple different ways. First, Latinx writers have not been featured prominently in any capacity in the theater, either as playwrights or as directors, producers, set designers, actors, etc. And we all know that because we know at the Emmys, we talk about this, or the Grammys, etc. Although oftentimes when we're talking about this, we're leaving Latins writ large, if you will, out. And when I use the term Latin, for those of us who use that term very consciously, we're talking about the colonized world. the world that Spain colonized. So we're kind of left out. And now that there's kind of a wave, a kind of renaissance, recuperating a lot of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic playwrights, I find that I found this barrier always in the US as a creative writer. There's a stable of writers who are allowed in, and there's a quota, and those who are not represented. And quite truthfully, Cuban Americans, Cuban playwrights have expressed this to me. Many of my colleague friends have expressed that they feel like there's also a hierarchy of kind of like who is included and who's not. And Cubans tend not to be included. Outside of Nilo Cruz, who do you think of as and maybe do people even think of Nilo, writing Anna in the Tropics, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for. So inclusion, exclusion, I interpret that way. Inclusion and inclusion, I also interpret in terms of the use of Spanish, which we were talking about. When do I make the decision to use Spanish? And in the novel, there are blocks of Spanish. Like there are letters that are not translated that are in Spanish, And in the play, to a lesser degree, I have blocks of Spanish. Most of the Spanish is translated in the next sentence in English. And there is some Spanglish, right? Because some of the characters would be speaking that. But part of it has to do with who the audience is. And I don't know, Kevin, how much you want me to continue to talk.
No, because I think it makes sense
to that.
Because we were talking a little bit about, I want to just sort of button this because I think it's really important, and I want to look at some of Brian's work. But in the play, and I have read your play a couple of times, we talked about your use of Spanish and how there's sort of back and forth. My first response when I was like, I don't speak Spanish, so I'm taken out of the moment. And I think your response is sort of like, that's okay, not including for a moment some members of the audience is actually quite powerful. Am I putting words in your mouth, or does that?
No, you totally are. And I don't want, it's the kind of calibrating, you don't want to lose your majority audience. But when the play was presented at Su Teatro, for example, there was a very small cohort of Cubans in the audience, and they would laugh at moments when no one in the theater would laugh. And part of it is the way Cubans talk. Like there's a line in the play that I don't translate, that when they're talking about an older daughter who is not married, and the mother is despairing. She's an old maid, right? She's not married by the time she's like 32, and she doesn't know what to do. So she starts to think about, well, maybe she could become a nun, and she could she could pray for her intentions, and we would have somebody, praying for us. And then she says a line in Cuban, and Lynn, I don't know if you know this line, that basically it's like, oh, she could dress the saints. That's the line in Spanish, okay? Vestir los santos. This is a line we would hear when anybody was over like 21 and they weren't, a female was not married, right? And there is no way to translate that line. And I also want the Cubans in the audience, or even the Caribbean people in the audience, because Brian, maybe some of these expressions we probably share, because our cultures and Puerto Rico culture are close, is that I want this moment to be for those people in the audience. For the first time, the play at that moment is about them, even if it's two people in the audience, which is something that a majority audience is always used to the play being about them, and even the historical references, Kevin, I kind of tamped them down. Like after the reading at Su Teatro, people were like, you need to make more visible the history and kind of explain it and all this stuff. And other people were like, no, you don't, because the story is not about the Cuban Revolution. It's about the impact of the revolution through generations in a very particular sector of the Cuban community, which is Chekhovian, as you mentioned to me, Kevin, it's the landed class, you know? And so I took those references out. But Spanish speaking people have told me there should be way more Spanish, and some Anglo, which I'll call Anglo, which we would out here in Colorado's audience members, readers, have said, get rid of all the Spanish. So as a playwright, I'm trying to decide who to include. And the last comment, which we've talked about so many times, is that it's not a bad thing when a majority English speaking audience has no idea what you're saying. Because, and I tell my students that when I teach literature, because they get angry, you know, because they're entitled. They feel like the play is always supposed to be for me. And I say to them, here's the point. How do you feel? How do you feel that people are laughing or that whatever, and that you are trying to figure out what is being said without losing the meaning or the thread of the play? But for once, they have no idea what's being said, and they feel like outsiders. Because even when you translate anything, like my dearest translator friend in France says, it's like kissing someone through a veil, okay? It's always going to have something lost in translation. And even if you translate it, the meaning, the history, the emotion is not always there.
And in a lot of ways, I think it's also reflective of, you know, it's like, okay, here's a taste of the immigrant experience, you know, for once you don't understand, but like here like there is a huge population of people that have to, not like, you know, just like going to a play and not understanding what's going on stage, but like live in their everyday lives trying to decipher what is going on by physicality, by rhythm, you know, by, you know, just pace. I think it's so interesting to hear that, to hear you saying that, because it's true. It's like for a second to, you know, put yourself in another person's shoes in that moment.
Yeah, and also examine, like, you don't have the chance always in a talk back to talk about, examine why somebody might feel so triggered. And what they have to come to terms with is their own sense of entitlement, that everything should be about me. I'm always used to everything being about me, and the world doesn't work that way. So it really pushes people out. And I love that it triggers some people, you know, when they feel excluded, you know, and feel angry and upset. But the question always is, you know, do we have the opportunity to unpack that? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to leave everybody just being angry, because that's all they think about, or they're obsessing over the 5 words they learned in Spanish class, you know, because it was required. So how do you calibrate that as an actor and a writer? Because I also, you know, in the Su Teatro presentation, even though they were Mexican-American actors, they took liberties with making little side comments, and they weren't always Cubanisms, you know, so because our languages are not always exactly the same, but they would also feel emotionally like they needed to make a comment, like, pues sí, you know, of course, you know, this kind of thing. So yeah, how do you calibrate those things?
Andrea, I want to, and Brian and Lynn, I want to shift just a little bit. And it's not really a shift, because I think this actually illustrates some of the things we're talking about. Brian, I thought we could maybe show a little bit from Exodus, and then at least the audience can see a track. We'll just look at one track of it, and then we can come back on the other side and talk a little bit more about it. While that's getting set up, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Jared Werner, who is setting up all the technology and all of this brilliance. So I appreciate that. And this mysterious person we keep mentioning, AJ Fafiades, who is a student who is a Daniel's ethics champion and has been working with me on Prologue the last couple of years. And in a moment, AJ is going to jump in here as well and ask a few questions. So without further ado, let's look at, I think this is track 9 from Brian's Exodus.
Mira lo que encontré. Tu edad, tu peso, tu bounty, 1800 to your name. Esos tejanos americanos de plano buscan su propiedad. Pero aquí no hay esclavo humano ni hay necesidad. Pero dime la verdad sobre una maldad. They say you killed a man. Is this you? Is it true? Please tell me if you can.
I was stunted from birth, served a brutal master and never once grunted, and now I'm being hunted. Murder is relative, especially when they murder your relatives and make the decision of where you live. The master's son made my baby sis a victim, so I had to stick him.
Por esa razón lograste escaparte, so I will keep you hidden. Te van a buscar y tratar de matar a cualquier que se pone en medio y quiere ayudar. Tú no quieres morir, hay que sobrevivir. Aunque vienen por ti, no te vayas de aquí, te prometo. Con todo poder y respeto voy a esconderte, protegerte. Si soy libre, tú también serás. There is room under the floor. You can hide under the boards. But go and rest now and pray they don't come to my door.
Just when you think that the war is won, another curve is thrown and you're back on the run. Back to square one with no time on the clock, fleeing gunshots and the masters.
Hey, someone's outside. Get to where it's safe. Go hide.
The floorboards creak as they speak about my whereabouts. Will Carlos sell me out? Or does he care about the meek slave under the floorboard, staring out of a crack, hoping they don't double back by these floorboards? Dear God above me, if you love me, you will see me through. I'm letting go of control and leaving it up to you. If there is some infinite wisdom you would like to give, let me have it now so that I can live.
That's so great. So great to see that, Brian. I want to watch the whole thing, but we don't have time. So now that we've seen a little bit of a taste of your work, could you talk a little bit about what we saw in that scene and perhaps a little bit about what went into creating it?
I mean, just get context of that piece. We're not writing it in chronological order. That's track 9. That's a little halfway over the midway point. It's Henry Haskins has crossed into Mexico, and historically, right, they came after you. You're a piece of you property. So, a runaway slave was property, so you were very valuable. So usually they don't want to get you back. So that gives you context to what that song is. Specifically talking about this piece in general and how language is used in it. The very earliest kind of idea of what this would be kind of that lost in translation feeling that you were talking about, Andrea, where Carlos, the Mexican citizen who doesn't speak English, and Henry, who doesn't speak Spanish, right? And what I actually wrote before that was an all English translation, and I think what's really it was translated. It was basically like they're speaking English because that's I guess that's where the problematic thing was. I wrote that and then had to kind of it was going to sleep at night being like, okay, well, who lives, who dies, or tells your story, and who gets to hear your story? The inclusivity of, okay, well, what am I doing here? Am I just doing this because the wide American theater, it's not our national language. English is not our national language, but it is our common language. It's the one that everybody speaks for the most part. And so, as soon as that kind of realization came, and my co-writer Nigel D. Robinson, who's phenomenal, he's amazing, he's so talented, he's so brilliant, was being like, well, let's do this. This video adaptation of whatever this is has subtitles, but the question being, do we have to, or is it okay to have people sit in not knowing, or is it amazing that a Spanish-speaking audience can come and get the story as well, or get their half of the story, do you know? And I think it's something beautiful of I think it goes into a larger conversation of, a changing of the system. Who is theater built for? Why is theater systemically kind of catered to a wealthier Anglo audience, English speaking audience. Why is that? And things are shifting not only in our theater industry but also in TV and in film. So the conclusion was, let's just kind of do it as historically accurate. So Carlos, they both live on the border, which would mean that the character of Henry, who is the runaway slave, would speak a little bit of Spanish. He would be able to kind of pick up a little bit. And same with Carlos, lives close to a recent new border because the border had just moved. That in that kind of territory, stealing, let's just call it. That Carlos would be able to speak a little English. So that's kind of how we landed on it. Where this project is kind of coming. We're dropping tracks like that, videos like that every single month until June of next year. So we're kind of figuring it out as we go. We're doing it not chronologically, so there's a lot of rules that we have to make up as we go, which is exciting. I've never written a play like that. I don't even know if this is I think it's a play, but I've never done it. Anything like this. It's just kind of Nigel and I have been in quarantine. Obviously, you could tell we're kind of not in the same space, and the video editing there, we're trying the best possible to make it seem like we're in the same space. But yeah, that's kind of the journey of how language fits in. With the context of that project.
Brian, there's a great conversation going on online as people are watching this, and the comments from the video are so far, wow, applause, wow, amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm trying to convince Brian that once COVID is over, Colorado Springs is a great place to continue working on
Yes, I would love that. Great to come.
It seems like, there's so many conversations on the table. We're obviously not going to get to talk about everything tonight. As I said, hopefully this gives rise to more conversations after tonight, but we still have some more time. So I want to turn this over to AJ. AJ has some questions that I think are so relevant related to ethics. And AJ, maybe you could just introduce yourself really briefly and then throw out some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So as he said earlier, I am AJ Vafiatis, and I am the Daniels Fund Ethics Ambassador for the Theater and Dance Department at UCCS. So I just want to go ahead and pose a couple questions. This first one is going to be for Dean Vidler, but if anyone else wants to have input, then you are more than happy to do so. So the first question is, we have talked a lot about adapting texts and languages of these plays. One of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles is accountability. So my question for you guys is, what are some ways that we may remain accountable to the original culture when translating texts to adjust to specific times or a specific audience?
Man, you didn't start with a softball, AJ. This is such a great question. And of course, as an ethical principle, we have to remember that not everybody is thinking in ethical terms all the time. So there are so many things that are wrapped into what gets produced and performed, and some of that is money. Some of that is this is why every ballet company all over the place produces the Nutcracker every single year, because it makes money, right? So that they can do some other projects, maybe more interesting projects, right? So I think, and there's also always, whatever the director is choosing to direct and for whom, right? So depending on why a text is chosen, where it's being performed and for whom, that director may or may not want to be intentionally accountable to the original culture of the text of the adaptation. So I just throwing out a couple of examples from Golden Age productions that I've seen. recently, and maybe some not so recently. So there's a director named Jason Yancey. He's a university faculty member, like Kevin. And he started at Brigham Young University, producing Spanish Golden Age plays only in Spanish for an audience that he knew was only English speaking, right? And the purpose of that was really about outreach and about awareness that the Spanish Golden Age was a thing. And it was fun and it was funny. Really was about trying to get you sort of hooked into a theater tradition that you might not have heard about, so that you might look into it more and see how cool it was. And they also they were working on an outreach grant to go to schools, right, in the local area, and they actually toured multiple states on this grant. And a lot of that was really about trying to help the Hispanic kids realize, oh, we actually, we've only been told about Shakespeare, but we actually have a cultural patrimony that's, from the same time period and actually even cooler and funnier, right? And so in order to help that audience understand, there were all kinds of, fun strategies, puppets and mime and music, and the program was like a comic book storyboard, so that you could sort of follow had the key things that were happening in each scene. And they sort of bent over backwards to try to communicate what was happening without translating anything at all, right? Anyway, so that's one approach. Another approach that I really saw, I think most prominently at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, Lawrence Boswell, who is formerly of the Royal Shakespeare Company, has done several translations of Spanish Golden Age plays, produced them at the RSC and other places in the UK, and did this at Stratford Shakespeare Festivals in Ontario, Canada. And he did a production of Fuente Ovejuna, which is one of the top two most known Spanish Golden Age plays, about a tyrannical overlord during Ferdinand and Isabel time frame, even though the play was written, much later than that, who, took advantage of the people he was supposed to protect, right? Raped the women, stole, property, and just basically enjoyed his, his power. And the town, decides to take matters into their own hands, so to speak, right? Well, so this particular production was, much more of a traditional kind of staging, in that really for a specific audience that was very familiar with Shakespeare, right? But did utilize some, what I would call like cultural structures. And this is something that I've researched, but things like lighting schemes that were straight out of Zurbarán and Velázquez paintings, right? Color schemes and things like that. So subtle, not necessarily something that you would necessarily know if you weren't familiar with that cultural production. But clearly sort of pull these cultural structures, into the staging. And so that's another way of doing it. And then other directors really aren't actually interested in being accountable necessarily to the original culture, and are much more focused on the sort of nugget thematic elements that resonate in that moment. So that same play I saw staged in New York City at the Repertorio Español, by Julian Mesri, who's an Argentinian director, and he staged that same play, instead of in like this small rural town, he staged it in a 21st century corporate office building. And this was right in the middle of Occupy Wall Street, right? So the tyrannical overlord was actually like the corporate CEO, abusing the power of like the lowly workers, right? And everything was sort of literally staged in like this open concept modern office building, right? Really nothing much accountable, I would say, to the original culture, except for that thematic nugget. And so it really just depends on, in my opinion, what is the project, what is the mission of that director, of that production, and it might be accountable in an ethical way or not. And this, of course, can also happen with casting, and especially would be, another issue that I guess that would be another whole hour that we'd have to talk about that. Yeah, Andrea.
I wonder if I may take a shot at this too, AJ. And if you hear howling at 8:00, Brian, people in Colorado howl so that we're communicating. So
Really?
if you hear that, forgive me. I closed the window. But I'd like to take a shot at that as a playwright. And Brian, be curious what you think, is that if I ever have a full production of my play, or even the digital reading or the kind of mini production, I would like, as I mentioned earlier, to have a Cuban cast, or at the very least, a Spanish Caribbean cast, because we have enough cultural bonds. So because I would want, for the very first time, to be true to the cultural context. Because even when Mexican American actors were performing it, it wasn't the same. But then the adaptation piece to me is lovely, because if a work is enduring, there's something that speaks across. It's kind of like, I've said this to Kevin, Keats' poem about the Grecian urn, that every generation interprets the images on that urn and they embrace it. And so I think of performances of Shakespeare on a jungle gym, a performance of Yerma on a trampoline, so kind of like what you're talking about, Lynn, is that if people outside the culture can connect to the play, which I think if you don't connect in some way, I don't use the word universal because I don't believe in it. But if people can, from a human experience, connect, I think in some way as a writer, I failed. But the very first version of it, I would like to be, because of my experience as an actor and a director, part of it, and have it inflected in Cuban, and translated in Cuban. But then where it goes from there, to me, is the gravy of this. And I don't know, Brian, I wonder what you think hearing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think in terms of accountability, I think it is a book that we are writing. It is something that we are making the rules of. The play is called Somewhere Over the Border. It's so interesting not to say an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz now, because it feels more like of a mashup, right? It feels like a mashup of trying to pay tribute to my mother's story, but also mashing it up with The Wizard of Oz, right? It feels like two things at once. But would I love to have an all Central American cast in it? Absolutely. There's actors who play music in it. It's more of a thing of. I once, I'm going to finish that thought in a second. I once, we've been kind of encountering, in Chicago, there was a huge controversy of an Italian-American playing Usnavi in the Heights, and people wanted to shut it down. And I get that, right? Of being to a certain extent, can a white person, even if they might pass, can as Latinx, can they really embody that character in a truthful way? Different than would you expect would you expect a regional production of In the Heights to always cast? I mean, Lin-Manuel isn't even Dominican like Usnavi is, right? I think we're moving to I think we are moving towards being should we put an able body in this disabled part? Should we put this, I am writing Mexodus knowing that I'm Central American, because to me, it's a flip of a border story. It's a time when Mexico opened its borders up to Americans. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of a weird alternate, and and is there somebody to hold me accountable for it? Like, like, yes, we're working with like Mexican drama, like a Mexican dramaturg, and we're trying to bring as much authenticity to it, because that's the way that we're going. But I think what's really what makes that question such a hard question to answer is that I think we're writing the rules currently on the ethics of and accountability. We're writing the rule book as we live and as we create. And that's what's really exciting. And also, like, it's good because people are asking questions about who is to hold you accountable? And also, is it okay? Is that all right? And what's good for me, I guess, is like being like giving a good amount of thought, like, I don't know if you like, Andrea, I want to see your play with all those Caribbean actors. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see the play that you envision it, and these conversations are good. It's good that we're having, I think, like accountability conversations, because it's we're just trying to be better, right? Like, as opposed to putting on brown face or like continuing to produce like racist plays. So I think it's a really great question, and one that would again probably take us a million, like we would probably talk for a long time, but
and you know what, Brian, it makes me laugh so much because after the Su Teatro presentation, where the actors were all Mexican American, the few Cubans in the audience were like, well, that didn't sound very Cuban, because they didn't pronounce things and they said some things that Cubans would never say. And it was really the ad lib. That was their one comment about the play, Yes. And so the other comment that I thought was hilarious, my mother actually was in the audience at 92 years of age. And I will not translate this, Kevin, but some of the characters completely out of character for their class and their age and even their gender say coño, and they get in this match like coño, coño. And my mother afterwards, and another older Cuban woman said, Andrea.
Oh wait, you just muted. You guys just got muted.
They came afterwards and they're like, we need to talk to you. We would never say coño. Whispering it to me, which is a very pejorative but very common expression in Cuba, and I will not translate it. But this kind of thing too is that you're never going to please everybody either, right?
I like, Andrea, that you muted when you started cursing, I suppose.
It's a good thing. I think my mother did that to me.
Just
my mother and my grandmother.
I think it's hilarious that like you can just say that without translating it, and like it's okay because we didn't translate.
It's okay.
No, it's really menos mal that we didn't translate that. But
I'm just sorry.
Have these words, right? Like joder, right? That my Spanish family members say joder, and they say it every 3 words, and it's like, oh my goodness, So yeah.
I want to turn to AJ. AJ, you was going to go ahead. Just because we only have a couple more minutes left, and AJ has another great question that I want to get hopefully a really quick answer from before we have to wrap for the night. Sorry, AJ, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, you're totally fine. Okay, so this last one, I want to go ahead and pose to Brian. So one of the Daniels Ethics principles is viability, which the Daniels Fund defines as creating long-term value. What is your hope for the future of Spanish language theater in America, and what do you hope we accomplish now to create long-lasting value for future generations?
That's a great question. Also another hard one. That's like another hard question. That's a great question. I think that idea of creating long value or longevity of a play or the future of America is a bit of a the reason that it's tough is because you can look at the statistics of how this country is growing, or if we talk about American theater and creating in it and the study of it, you look at numbers and you see how this country is shaping out to be. By 2050, they say that this country will be like there will be an omega race of like just like a jumble of race, like just like freckled faced, curly haired, like brown, like just brown, like this amalgamation of all colors that creates this brown omega race that speaks a bunch of different languages that, you know, and it's an interesting experiment, right? Like this country is an experiment. There's not really another country that's quite like us in that way. And so for me, the future is kind of a blowing up of the system we have now. Like it goes back to that question of like I'm ingrained to want to write most of my plays in English because I know that that's what the system is now. Like that's how we've created it, you know, like it's an older, wealthier white audience that pays for subscriptions, but it's because those subscriptions are expensive. You know, how do we make it's a question about accessibility and also like seeing how this country is moving forward. And my hope, right, is that that our industry becomes a much more inclusive art form and a more inclusive. I mean, yes, theater is a pastime, but it's also like I consider it to be a necessity of our culture. And which is why, you know, I'm scared for us right now and really hoping that Congress passes some, you know, help for artists in this time. So to me, I also say that knowing that I'm not responsible for any of this change. Like I'm just going to keep making my work and keep, you know, writing in speak truth to power, right? Like keep writing in the languages that I know. Doing that, I had a very similar experience to Andrea. We were doing a show at the Kennedy Center, and there's a little part. I was and again another adaptation of Mark Twain's *The Prince and the Pauper*, set in like a 2050 era America. And at the very end, the pauper, the prince comes back, right? Everybody knows that story, right? The prince comes back, they switch back, and the prince is just like, I understand what your life has been, you know? I understand what it is. And they switched clothes, but it was also like a different, the pauper was an immigrant who barely spoke any English. And he's just like, I understand what your life is like. I lived it. And the pauper, the immigrant boy, responds in an all Spanish monologue. And he says in Spanish, you like the book, right? Actually different from the book is, there's no way that you could understand what my life has been like after 3 days. It's impossible. You can't ever know. You couldn't possibly have experienced a lifetime of my life in 3 days. And I had that experience where like the kids that got it, like, it inspired me. It's hopeful. The kids that understood it and could translate it to their friends who didn't speak it. I don't know. That's like a small glimpse of like hope for me. That's an amazing thing. In DC, like, which has a huge Salvadoran population. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for change, and I'm hopeful for a more inclusive, more Spanish-leaning theater scene. You know, one that includes more Latinos, Latinxes.
Brian, that's fabulous. And I know I had to tell you all, I have to wrap after because we're at time, we're over time. And so I know there's some questions from the audience, and I wrote to you all, I apologize, we have to, but we'll try to get to some of your questions in part 2, because AJ and I were writing while we were listening to all this, we have to do part 2 and part 3 and part 4. There's so much wonderful stuff being said, and I can't thank enough Andrea and Brian and Lynn for your time tonight to sort of get us thinking about these things, and be back for part 2, and maybe in person. Brian, is that right? Maybe we can.
Yeah, let's do it.
Also, thank you, AJ. Thank you, Jared. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and thank all of our sponsors who I mentioned at the top of the hour. We couldn't do it without you. We're going to have more prologues, probably in a digital form, for the next few months, and I'll get you information on the great guests we have coming up. But for now, for all of us, thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Good night.